The winter of 1965 arrived in Las Vegas with the particular cold clarity that the desert produced when the sky was completely cloudless, and the sun had gone down, and the neon of the Strip was the only warmth available in any direction. And Frank Sinatra sat in the back of his car outside the Sands Hotel at midnight, watching his driver wait for instructions that Frank Sinatra had not yet formed into words, because the thing he had just seen inside the hotel was still organizing itself into something he could act on rather than simply react to. And what he had seen was this. In the corridor between the main casino floor and the service entrance, a corridor that Frank Sinatra had cut through because it was the fastest route from the stage to his car on nights when he did not want to work the room after a show. He had passed a young woman sitting on the floor against the wall with her knees drawn up, and her face turned away from the corridor traffic in the specific manner of someone who was crying, and did not want to be seen crying, and had misjudged how visible the corridor would be at this hour. And Frank Sinatra had almost walked past her the way most people walked past uncomfortable things in hotel corridors, had almost completed the 10 steps that would have taken him to the service door and out into the cold air and into his car, but he had not completed them, had stopped after 7 steps without quite knowing why he was stopping, and had turned back and stood near the woman without speaking for a moment, and then had said, very quietly, "Are you all right?" Which was the question that people asked when they could see that someone was not all right, but that served the function of announcing a presence without requiring an immediate accounting of whatever the presence had interrupted. The woman's name was Sandra Price, and she was 26 years old, and she had been working as a cocktail waitress at the Sands for 14 months. And she looked up at Frank Sinatra with the specific expression of someone caught between the embarrassment of being found in a moment of private distress and the relief of being found by someone who had asked a genuine question, rather than offering the performative concern that people sometimes deployed in these situations to make themselves feel helpful without taking on any actual responsibility. And she said, "I'm fine, I'm sorry." And Frank Sinatra said, "You don't look fine and you don't need to apologize for sitting in a corridor." And Sandra said, "I'll be okay, I just needed a minute," which was the kind of thing people said when they needed considerably more than a minute but did not want to burden a stranger with the full accounting of what they actually needed. And Frank Sinatra, who had been reading that particular sentence for long enough to have developed an accurate interpretation of it, said, "Take as many minutes as you need, I'm not in a hurry," and sat down against the wall a few feet from Sandra in the specific way that communicates that a person intends to stay without crowding the person they are staying near. And there was a silence that was not entirely comfortable, but that was also not hostile. The kind of silence that arrives when two people are sharing a space without having established the terms of the sharing. What Sandra Price eventually told Frank Sinatra, in pieces, and with pauses between them that Frank Sinatra did not try to fill, was that she had been fired that evening by the Sands food and beverage manager, a man named Garrett who Sandra described without elaboration, and who Frank Sinatra understood from the description without needing the elaboration, and that the stated reason for the firing was a complaint from a guest about Sandra's service on a table she had covered 3 weeks earlier, a complaint that Sandra believed was false, and that she believed was related not to her service, but to her refusal, 2 months ago, to accept the kind of attention from the same guest that cocktail waitresses in Las Vegas in 1965 were frequently expected to accept from guests who had money and whose continued business the hotel valued, and that Garrett had told Sandra that the guest's complaint was the reason, but that Sandra knew the actual reason was that she had made the hotel's relationship with a valued guest uncomfortable by not being sufficiently accommodating, and that this was the second job Sandra had lost in 2 years for the same reason, and that she was calculating in her head right now what she had in her account, and how long it would last, and what she was going to do next. Frank Sinatra listened to all of this, and when Sandra finished, he did not say the things that people typically said in response to these situations, did not say that the hotel was wrong, or that the guest was a specific kind of person, or that Sandra should take legal action, or any of the other responses that were accurate but not useful in the way that Sandra needed something to be useful right now. And instead he said, What kind of work can you do besides this? And Sandra said, I have a degree in hotel administration from UNLV. I finished it last year at night while I was working here. And Frank Sinatra said, why are you still working tables if you have a hotel administration degree? And Sandra said, because hotel administration jobs go to people who know people and I don't know people. And Frank Sinatra said, you know me now, in a tone that was matter-of-fact rather than grandiose, the tone of someone stating a practical reality rather than making an offer of charity. And Sandra looked at him for a moment and said, I'm not sure that counts. And Frank Sinatra said, it counts significantly more than you might think. What specifically did you study in hotel administration? And Sandra told him, and the telling revealed that she had focused on operations management and event coordination, and had done her thesis on staffing efficiency in large-scale entertainment venues, which was work that was directly relevant to the operational challenges of running a property like the Sands. And Frank Sinatra filed this information and said, give me your telephone number. And Sandra gave it to him with the expression of someone who is not entirely sure they believe what they are doing will result in anything, but who is too tired and too in need of something to work to decline. Frank Sinatra's conversation with Jack Entratter, who managed the Sands and who had a relationship with Frank Sinatra that was built on mutual professional respect and several years of shared history, happened the following morning at 9 o'clock over coffee in Jack's office. And Frank Sinatra described the situation in the corridor and described Sandra Price and her degree and her thesis topic and the reason for her firing. And Jack listened with the attention of someone who is receiving information from a person whose observations he takes seriously. And when Frank Sinatra finished, Jack said, Garrett handled it badly, without specifying what Garrett had handled badly, because Frank Sinatra had not specified what had led to Sandra's firing, had described it only as a situation involving guest behavior that Sandra had declined to accommodate. And Jack understood what that meant because Jack ran a hotel in Las Vegas in 1965 and understood the geography of these situations with precision. And Jack said, what are you asking me to do? And Frank Sinatra said, I'm asking you to look at her resume, and if her qualifications are what she described to me, to consider whether there's a position in operations management that she should be interviewed for. And Jack said, that's not how we usually fill those positions. And Frank Sinatra said, I know how you usually fill those positions, Jack. And what I'm asking is whether the usual way is the only acceptable way, or whether a qualified person from a non-usual source is worth an interview. And Jack looked at Frank Sinatra for a moment and said, send me her resume. And Frank Sinatra said, she'll have it to you by tomorrow, and stood up and left Jack's office, and called Sandra Price from the lobby of the Sands, and told her to have her resume delivered to Jack Entratter's office by the following morning, and that she should follow up with a phone call the day after, and that she should not mention Frank Sinatra's name in any of this, because the resume and the qualifications needed to speak for themselves, rather than arriving on the back of someone else's recommendation. Sandra Price delivered her resume to Jack Entratter's office the following morning and called 2 days later, and was told that Mr. Entratter had reviewed her materials and would like to schedule an interview. And the interview happened the following week and lasted 90 minutes, which was significantly longer than the interviews the Sands typically conducted for entry-level operations positions. And at the end of the interview, Jack offered Sandra a position as an assistant operations coordinator with a salary that was 4 times what she had been earning as a cocktail waitress. And Sandra sat across from Jack in his office and said yes, and then asked if she could ask a question. And Jack said of course, and Sandra said, did Frank Sinatra have anything to do with this interview? And Jack looked at her and said, your resume is what got you the interview, your qualifications are what got you the offer, which was true as far as it went, and which was also an answer to a question without answering the question that had been asked. And Sandra understood this and said, I understand, and did not ask further. Frank Sinatra was in Palm Springs by the time Sandra Price started her new position at the Sands, and he did not attend her first day, or send a note, or make any acknowledgement of the fact that something he had set in motion had arrived at a resolution, because setting things in motion and then tracking their arrival was not the relationship he maintained with the things he set in motion. And Sandra Price spent the following 6 years at the Sands building the kind of operational expertise that her degree had prepared her for, eventually becoming operations manager of the property, and then moving to a larger role at another Vegas hotel in 1971. And her career from that point followed the trajectory of someone who had the qualifications and the intelligence for the work and who had been given, once, the opportunity to demonstrate these things to someone who could act on what they saw. The night in the Sands corridor in 1965 was something Sandra mentioned only once in a professional context, which was in a speech she gave at a hotel management conference in 1984, when she was in her mid-40s and had been running operations at a major Las Vegas property for several years. And the speech was about the structural barriers that the hospitality industry placed in front of qualified people who came from non-traditional channels. And Sandra told the story of the corridor without identifying Frank Sinatra by name, describing only a person who had sat down on the floor of a hotel corridor at midnight and had asked a practical question rather than a sympathetic one, had asked what she could do rather than expressing feeling about what had been done to her. And Sandra said that this distinction between practical attention and sympathetic attention was the distinction that had made the difference in her case, and that the industry would benefit from more people who sat down on floors and asked practical questions rather than remaining standing and offering sympathetic responses that led nowhere. Las Vegas in the winter of 1965 had been cold and bright in the particular way of desert winters and had contained, in a service corridor of the Sands Hotel at midnight, a conversation between two people that lasted 25 minutes and that produced, eventually, a career. And Frank Sinatra sat in the back of his car after the conversation had ended and told his driver to take him to the airport because he had an early flight the following morning and wanted to get some sleep. And the car pulled away from the Sands into the desert cold, and the neon of the strip receded in the rear window until it was just light against the darkness. And Frank Sinatra sat with his hands in his lap and thought about nothing in particular, which was the mental state that followed having done something that was complete and did not require further thinking. And the desert received the car, and the road ahead was lit by headlights. And the night was very clear and very cold and full of the specific silence of a landscape that had been here before Las Vegas and would be here after it, indifferent and permanent, and entirely unconcerned with the small human arrangements occurring on its surface, including the arrangement that had just been made between a man who stopped walking and a woman who had misjudged how visible a corridor would be at midnight.